They laughed when she walked into the gala with her notebook, a 13-year-old girl among billionaires and polished speeches. But when Eliza stepped onto that stage and calmly revealed a billion-dollar fraud hidden behind fake smiles and glossy slides, the world stopped breathing. What began as an awkward mother-daughter outing shattered the illusion of untouchable power and ignited a global reckoning. This isn't just a story about numbers. It's about a girl who turned silence into a weapon and forced the world to listen, whether it was ready or not. They arrived exactly on time, which meant they were already being watched. The red carpet outside the ballroom gleamed under artificial lights and glittered camera flashes, not because it was special, but because it was expected. Everything at the Wexley Foundation's annual Gala for Global Impact was about optics. The suits, the gowns, the champagne flutes, all perfectly curated to send one signal: we belong here. Samantha hadn't planned to attend, not really. She didn't care for parties where people shook hands like negotiations and made compliments sound like currency. But this year, she couldn't say no. The board had insisted, the invites were embossed, and more importantly, her daughter had asked to come. Eliza stood beside her in a black dress, one size too big, and boots no one expected under tulle. She didn't fidget. She didn't smile for the cameras. She just looked, calm, sharp, and absorbing everything. At 13, Eliza was already too observant for comfort. She saw numbers the way musicians saw sound, alive and in motion. Samantha had spent years learning to follow that instinct, to understand the threads her daughter pulled out of spreadsheets and flowcharts like secrets waiting to be revealed. Most people didn't know what to do with that kind of mind. They saw it as odd, intense, inconvenient. Tonight she knew they'd see it as out of place. The doorman raised an eyebrow when they approached. "And who's this?" he asked too brightly. "My daughter," Samantha said evenly. "She's on the list." The doorman scanned his tablet, paused, then gave a small nod. Of course. Inside, the ballroom glittered with soft jazz and colder smiles. People turned to look. They always did when someone broke the unspoken code of elegance. Eliza didn't care. She walked with her chin up, holding a folded notebook in one hand and a silent challenge in her posture. Samantha saw the whispers start before they'd even reached the welcome table. Who brings a child to an event like this? What does she think this is? Bring your daughter to the Ritz? Doesn't she know how serious this evening is? Samantha smiled. Let them talk. The speeches began an hour later, after wine had loosened the room and flattery had rounded its edges. The foundation's chairperson took the stage, microphone perfectly adjusted, voice honed by decades of public performance. He spoke about innovation, about partnerships, about the importance of transparency in global enterprise. Samantha recognized the cadence. The audience didn't hear the pauses because they were trained not to. They heard what they expected to hear, polished virtue. Eliza leaned in close to her mother. "That number's wrong," she whispered. Samantha turned. "Which one?" "The third slide," Eliza said, unfolding her notebook. The chart he showed with the orphanage investment returns. He added a 0. "Eliza? It's been bothering me all week. I looked into it. I thought maybe it was just a placeholder, but it's not." She flipped the notebook around. Line after line of reference data, cross-matched against public filings, tax records, donation reports. Samantha stared. "Eliza, where did you get this?" "I followed the filings like you taught me. They've been cycling funds through a shell account in the Caymans. It bounces twice, through a security firm and a consulting group, then lands back in the foundation's main ledger with a new label, Impact Reserve Allocation. It looks like a grant. It's not. They're folding the same capital 3 times. Samantha blinked. Her hands went cold. "And the 0? Eliza pointed to a red circle on the paper. "That's the difference. 1 decimal shift. It inflates their ROI by 800%. Before she could speak, the chairperson smiled and gestured toward their table. "And now," he said warmly, "we'd like to invite Samantha Wells to the stage, one of our brightest partners in transparency, and tonight's honored guest." The spotlight hit before she had a chance to say no. Eliza looked up at her mother and said with terrifying calm, "You don't have to say anything. Just hand me the mic." Samantha hesitated only a second. Then she stood, took her daughter's hand, and led her to the stage. The room went still. The laughter and murmurs faded into the hush that only money and discomfort can summon. Samantha reached the podium, adjusted the mic, and stepped aside. Eliza stepped up. "Hi," she said. "I wasn't on the agenda, but I noticed something wrong in the numbers tonight, and I thought you'd want to know." A pause. She held up the notebook. "On slide 3, the ROI on the Foundation's Overseas Orphanage Initiative is listed as 1,400%. That's not correct. It's closer to 600. The reason it looks higher is because the same capital is being folded through 3 shells, one in the Caymans, one in London, and one disguised as a consulting disbursement." The room froze. Eliza kept going. "I tracked the filings for the last 8 quarters. Each time the money loops, it comes back with a new label and a new valuation. On paper, it looks like growth. In reality, it's the same fund circulated. This is fraud. At least $1 billion worth." Silence. No one moved. Samantha didn't speak. She didn't need to. Eliza stepped back from the mic. "That's all. I just thought someone should say it." The room erupted. Not in applause, not in outrage, in confusion, in motion, people standing, whispers sharpening, the chairperson blinking, mouth open, words caught. Someone shouted for the deck to be reloaded. Others pulled out their phones. Samantha reached out, took her daughter's hand, and together they stepped off the stage as the room fractured behind them. Outside, the night was cold. Eliza looked up. "Did I ruin it?" she asked. Samantha knelt, smiled. "No," she said. "You saved something they were too scared to see." And the next morning, the world saw it too. The headlines hit before breakfast. They were everywhere, plastered across finance blogs, social media, the morning news tickers that ran under coffee shop TVs, and airport monitors. Samantha woke to pings on her phone stacked like a collapsed tower. She didn't check them right away. She stood instead at the kitchen window, watching the backyard where the wind moved slow and steady through the trees, where the silence didn't care what the world was screaming. Eliza padded into the kitchen a few minutes later in thick socks and her oversized hoodie, hair still tangled from sleep, notebook tucked under one arm, like always. "They published it," she said. Samantha nodded. "All of them. They called it $1 billion fraud." She sounded surprised, not at the number, but at the weight of it. "It was." "I know," Eliza said softly, "but it was still just a zero, just one number." Samantha turned. "One number is all it ever takes." Eliza sat at the table and opened her notebook, not to add anything, but to reread. Her eyes scanned the rows like someone reviewing memory, not data. Her hands were steady. She didn't look proud. She looked focused. The same look she wore whenever she was solving a problem. That's what this was to her. Not a scandal, not an act of bravery, a problem, a contradiction that needed clarity. She hadn't exposed it to be defiant. She'd done it because it was true, because it wasn't right, because someone needed to say so and no one else was. The phone rang. Samantha didn't answer. Then came a knock at the door. Eliza didn't flinch. Samantha opened it to find a reporter standing on the porch with a notepad and an apologetic smile. "Ms. Wells, I'm sorry to bother you." Samantha shook her head. "We're not giving statements." "I understand," the reporter said, "but people want to know. Why did she say it then? Why not wait? Why not tell someone privately?" From behind her, Eliza answered. "Because they were lying publicly." The reporter blinked. Samantha stepped aside, not to invite him in, but to let her daughter speak if she wanted. Eliza stood, still holding her notebook. They used the stage to sell a story about trust, so I used the same stage to correct it. If they'd said those numbers in a boardroom, I would have waited. But they said them into a microphone, in front of cameras. That's where the truth needed to live too. The reporter didn't ask another question. He just nodded, backed away, and left. By noon, the calls started coming from the foundation. Emails, too. The board issued a statement. It was long, full of terms like unintended discrepancies and complex accounting structures. It didn't deny anything. It didn't name Eliza. It couldn't. She'd shown her math. She'd spoken clearly. They couldn't argue with precision. That afternoon, Samantha watched her daughter sit at the dining table sketching a new set of charts. Not for the foundation, but for herself. Trying to understand how the money moved in the quarters before the ones she'd already examined. Her questions were broader now. Not just where the fraud had occurred, but when it had started. Who had seen it? Who had said nothing? She didn't ask if Samantha thought she should stop. She already knew the answer. That evening, Samantha made dinner while Eliza ran a heat map simulation of a decade's worth of global impact disbursements. She did it casually, the way other kids worked on science fair posters, not out of spectacle, out of interest, out of necessity. And when Samantha sat across from her with 2 plates of food and asked, "Are you okay?" Eliza looked up and said, "I'm not angry, I'm just not confused anymore." It took days for the dust to settle. Not the noise never settles, but the meaning underneath it. The headlines moved on. The story became a symbol. Eliza was a whistleblower in some articles, a prodigy in others. None of them got it right. She hadn't been trying to whistle. She hadn't been trying to shine. She'd just been listening, watching, checking the math, asking questions the room didn't expect because the room had already decided it knew what it was talking about. Weeks later, at a community town hall, someone recognized her, a teacher. She approached slowly, not with a request, but with curiosity. "I don't think I could have done what you did," she said, "but I think I'd like to teach my students how to see what you saw." Eliza smiled. "Start by teaching them that the numbers are always telling a story. Most people just don't read all the way through." Samantha stood behind her then, not to protect, but to witness. Her daughter had already protected herself with clarity, with truth. And the next time someone tried to scoff, the room would hesitate. Because the girl they thought didn't belong had once stood on their stage, notebook in hand, and made the truth too sharp to ignore. The first quiet day came exactly 9 days after the gala. No headlines, no new emails, no interviews waiting in her inbox. Just a soft gray morning with rain tapping at the windows and the smell of toast drifting lazily through the kitchen. Samantha watched the sky while Eliza sat at the table in her hoodie, legs folded underneath her, reading through another audit disclosure. Not from the foundation, but from a corporate partner they'd once praised in a keynote. Eliza didn't say anything as she read. Her eyes moved fast, pausing only to underline or circle or jot something in the margins of her notebook. Samantha didn't ask what she'd found. She knew her daughter would tell her when it was ready to be said out loud. The house felt smaller lately, not because anything had changed inside it, but because of the space Eliza now occupied in the world. The stage had made her visible, but the aftermath had made her known. People whispered about her online, often as a kind of myth. The girl with the notebook, the kid who saw the zero. But to Samantha, she was still just Eliza. Still the same girl who once corrected a news broadcast caption mid-dinner, who sorted her socks by length and her spreadsheets by pattern irregularity, who sat on the floor to think better because chairs felt too rigid for her logic to stretch. What had changed was the way people responded to her silence. Before, they had overlooked it. Now, they read it like a warning. By midday, the rain turned to a soft mist. Eliza stood and stretched, walked to the window, and pressed her forehead lightly against the glass. Samantha, from across the room, asked quietly, "Want to take a break?" Eliza didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I think I've been chasing the wrong end of the string." Samantha raised an eyebrow, familiar with the metaphor. "How far back?" Eliza tapped her notebook. 2 fiscal years. It's not just the foundation. It's the donor routing. Some of their partners are folding capital back into the primary trust, but under different legal entities. It's cleaner than the foundation's move, but it's still a loop. Samantha set down her cup. "You think they knew?" "They knew enough not to file the same way twice," Eliza said. There was no outrage in her voice, no triumph, just the calm observation of a person noticing gravity before everyone else feels the fall. Later, they walked in silence through the wet streets, their boots leaving soft prints on the concrete. The city hadn't decided yet if it wanted to treat Eliza as a problem, a hero, or something else entirely. But the world around her had changed its shape. People moved differently when they saw her. They spoke more carefully. They asked more quietly. A few times someone had stopped them, recognizing her by the shape of her eyes or the rhythm of her voice. Always to say thank you. Never to ask permission. When they reached the small cafe on the corner, they took their usual table. The owner, who had known them for years, brought over 2 mugs without asking and said, "You've been keeping the grown-ups honest." Eliza smiled faintly. They made the numbers lie first. By the time they got home, the mist had thickened into foam. Samantha lit the fireplace, and Eliza went straight to her desk, unfolding the pages she'd printed and laying them out in a perfect grid across the floor. Each page was marked in red, blue, and black. Red for data inconsistencies, blue for structural gaps, black for questions she hadn't answered yet. Samantha stood at the doorway watching her and asked, "Are you scared at all?" Eliza didn't look up. "No, but I know they are." And it was true. The silence from the foundation wasn't disinterest. It was fear wrapped in hesitation. They hadn't tried to disprove her. They'd tried to disappear her. But you couldn't disappear the truth once it had been spoken on stage and heard by every person who'd nodded along to their numbers. Eliza hadn't just exposed the fraud. She'd exposed the ease with which it had happened, and that was harder to forgive. As the night deepened and the fog curled against the windows, Samantha stepped out to the porch wrapped in a blanket, staring at the orange glow of the neighborhood streetlights. Inside, she could still hear the quiet rustle of pages and the light tapping of Eliza's pencil. They hadn't planned for any of this. The gala had just been a formality, a photo op, a stage they were never meant to speak from. But Eliza had spoken. She had stood under that light, notebook in hand, and said what no one else was willing to say. Not because she wanted credit, but because the math didn't lie. Only the people did, and Samantha had watched the whole world pause to hear her daughter tell the truth. She turned back to the door, hand resting on the knob, and whispered to herself, "They'll never doubt her again." And she was right. They wouldn't. The fog held through the morning, blanketing the world in a stillness so complete that it felt like something was waiting. Samantha moved through the house quietly, barefoot on cold wood floors, coffee in one hand, notebook in the other. She didn't wake Eliza. Her daughter had worked past midnight, papers scattered across her desk in layers so deliberate they looked chaotic to anyone else. But Samantha knew better. She had watched her daughter build logic from noise since she was old enough to hold a pencil. Every line Eliza drew had a reason. Every circled number was a breadcrumb. And now, those breadcrumbs had led her straight into the financial core of a billion-dollar organization and unraveled it in front of an entire ballroom of people who hadn't even known they were being lied to. When Eliza finally emerged, hoodie zipped to her chin. She moved without ceremony. She poured a glass of orange juice, picked up her tablet from the table, and sat. There was no performance to her silence, no sulking, no weariness, Just thought. Always thought. Samantha waited until the second sip of juice before asking, "What's next?" Eliza didn't look up. "I found a second loop. This one's buried deeper, and the amounts are smaller, but it's the same pattern. They shift funds between a scholarship program and a development initiative, claim each as a separate pool, and then re-report the overlap as yield." "How far back?" 6 years. I think it's been running quietly ever since their last major grant cycle. There's a tax offset trail that stops in 2017. It doesn't match the report." Samantha leaned back. "Are you going to take it public?" Eliza nodded. "Eventually, but not before I map the whole structure. If I only say part of it, they'll reframe the narrative. I need to be the loudest signal before they can jam it." That was how she talked now, not with defiance. With calibration. She wasn't just speaking truth. She was shaping its velocity. Samantha knew what that meant. It meant the pitch would come again. Not in a ballroom this time, but in something quieter, more surgical. Calls from lawyers, whispers from press people, suggestions that she misunderstood what she'd seen. Samantha had lived through it. She'd survived it. But now it was her daughter, walking that path, 13 years old, and already carrying the weight of clarity in a world designed to outlast it. Later that day, an invitation arrived in Samantha's inbox. A conference on ethical finance, not a gala, a gathering. The kind where people sat in circles and tried to unlearn what the markets had taught them. The organizer had written, "We would like your daughter to speak, not as a symbol, but as a practitioner. What she did was not just brave, it was precise." Samantha forwarded the email to Eliza. Minutes later, a response popped up on her phone. Eliza had replied directly. "Thank you. I'll speak if I can show the structure of what broke, not just the moment it broke. I don't want applause. I want attention." Samantha smiled alone in the kitchen. That was the thing most people misunderstood. Eliza didn't want to be famous. She didn't want to be the face of anything. She wanted to be heard, yes, but more than that, she wanted to be understood. The gala had been the beginning, but it wasn't the point. The point was the math, the data, the pattern she had seen that no one else bothered to look for because the numbers had been dressed in words like philanthropy and impact. That evening, they printed the filings, 300 pages. Samantha helped highlight them in layers, spreading them out across the floor until the living room looked like the inside of a courtroom. They mapped out where the funds moved, where the cycles began to echo, where the same capital appeared twice under different names. It was Eliza who noticed the signatures, the same set of initials, appearing across years under 2 different titles, a name that moved like a shadow through the filings. "I think this is the architect," she said. Samantha looked at her daughter, cross-legged on the floor, eyes tracking lines of logic like paths in a forest. "You going to expose them?" "I'm going to show their math." The next morning, they submitted the report, not to the press, not to the public, to a regulatory firm with no ties to the foundation and a reputation for untangling financial obfuscation. They didn't sign it with names. They signed it with documentation. They didn't attach a story. They attached the math. Within a week, the regulators responded. "The analysis is correct. We've opened an inquiry." Eliza read the message twice, nodded once, and closed her laptop. Samantha waited. Eliza said, "They're going to try to make it political." "Then what?" "Then I remind them that fraud isn't an opinion." And that was it. The next time Eliza spoke publicly, it wasn't on a stage. It was on a panel of adults who kept using words like inspiration and voice of the future. She listened quietly. When it was her turn, she said, "I'm not the future. I'm just the one who saw the error. And if a 13-year-old can find a billion-dollar mistake, maybe the systems we trust need less confidence and more scrutiny." No one laughed. They just listened. They left the panel early, slipping out the side door while the moderator wrapped up the final talking points and the rest of the attendees buzzed with the kind of awkward energy that follows being politely, precisely dismantled. Samantha walked 2 steps behind Eliza as they moved through the hallway, not because she was letting her daughter lead, but because Eliza was already moving at a pace that had nothing to do with walking. Her mind was somewhere else, not in the past, not in the applause, somewhere forward, always forward. Outside, the sky was pale blue and high with a kind of clarity that made the whole day feel sharpened. Neither of them spoke until they reached the edge of the parking lot. "They're going to frame it as disruption," Eliza said. "They already are, like I did something impolite by noticing." "They're not used to someone showing the receipts before the press gets the story," Samantha replied. "It's not even about the receipts. It's about the structure. It's broken. They want it to be a story so they don't have to fix the structure." Samantha smiled, tired, but proud. "Then you're going to have to keep showing them where it breaks." They got into the car, both of them still holding the weight of the day, though differently. Samantha carried it in her shoulders, her chest, that quiet place where pride and fear sit next to each other. Eliza carried it behind her eyes, the way she stared out the window, fingers tapping silently against her notebook, already calculating, already parsing the fallout. She didn't enjoy what she'd done. She didn't bask in the discomfort of the panelists, but she understood the importance of it. She understood that the only reason people were forced to face what she saw was because she didn't let them look away. Back home, the living room was still covered in filings. The soft clatter of leaves outside and the hum of the heater gave the house a kind of grounded quiet, as if it, too, were exhaling. Eliza dropped her bag at the door and walked straight to the floor, stepping over spreadsheets and highlighted pages, kneeling down by the last stack she hadn't marked up yet. She picked up the folder and flipped it open. "This one's different," she said. Samantha walked over, knelt beside her. "How?" Eliza ran her finger across the numbers. "These 2 fund names, they're new. Just appeared in the last quarter. They weren't in any of the records before. They're not listed in the annual report, no trace in the operating expenses. But they pulled $2.3 million each, and they used a name that echoes a different initiative, close enough to be ignored." "They're hiding it in branding," Samantha said. "In semantics," Eliza replied. They spent the next hour running down the names. Domains registered 3 months ago, email addresses that bounced, no LinkedIn records, no staff listed. But both funds had press blurbs, lightweight, unverified, designed for fast media consumption. Samantha read the copy aloud, supporting regional equity through strategic uplift programming. "What does that even mean?" Eliza asked. "It means nothing," Samantha said. "Exactly," Eliza replied. The money, they discovered, had been funneled to a third-party intermediary that had previously been sanctioned in an unrelated procurement review. It had changed names, again, a new shell on top of an old game. By midnight, they had mapped the flow. By morning, they had already documented the diversion, another 10 million, misdirected, under the cover of philanthropic language and recycled purpose statements. Eliza sat back on her heels, staring at the network diagram they had printed and taped to the wall. "This is the part where they start making calls," she said. "The emails from lawyers, the requests for meetings. They'll tell us we're young, that we're misinformed, that we misunderstood." "And will we?" Samantha asked. Eliza didn't blink. "No, because I asked the math first." The next time they went public, they didn't wait for an invitation. They published the findings directly. No op-eds, no press tour, just the report, laid out in plain terms, with citations and timelines and the full breakdown of how funds had been repackaged to look like growth when they were just echoing through empty channels. It spread quietly at first, through finance blogs, compliance circles, then policy forums. Then it exploded. This time the response wasn't disbelief, it was exhaustion. People weren't shocked. They were just finally ready to admit they'd suspected for years and hadn't known how to prove it. Eliza didn't issue a statement. She didn't go on camera. She simply updated the final line of the report's summary. What you call disruption is just someone noticing too early for your comfort. Samantha read it 3 times, then closed the file, then whispered to herself, "They're never going to be early enough again." Because now the room always knew. If the girl with the notebook was watching, they better get the numbers right. Winter returned with sharp wind and clean light, the kind that makes everything look honest. Samantha stood at the window of their kitchen, coffee warm in her hands, watching the frost build in feathered layers on the edges of the glass. Behind her, Eliza sat on the floor, barefoot in a hoodie 2 sizes too big, surrounded by printed records, color-coded tabs, and a mess of highlighters that made the carpet look like someone had spilled a rainbow across it. She had been up late again, not from stress, but from clarity, the kind of rare mental rhythm that wouldn't allow sleep until the last number was checked, the last edge aligned. The latest case wasn't an accident. It had landed in Eliza's inbox wrapped in caution. A mid-level analyst from a European development fund reaching out anonymously, unsure of what he'd stumbled across. The email was short, nervous, no attachments, just a sentence. "I think someone's moving money where no one's supposed to look." That was all it took. Eliza hadn't responded right away. She'd spent 2 days combing through the fund's open reports, watching for patterns, comparing line items, staring at lists of partner organizations until the shapes of the words stopped meaning anything and became movements. That was how she always found it. Not in the obvious, not in the lines that screamed for attention, in the places where the data changed tempo, where the rhythm slipped. That's where truth lived. By the time she traced the shell company behind the routing, registered under a 3-letter acronym that had never once filed an activity report, she already had the rest of the picture mapped. It wasn't huge, not yet, just under $86 million in redirected funds across a 5-year arc, quiet, subtle, methodical. But it was the intent that mattered. This wasn't negligence, it was design. Samantha sat beside her daughter that morning, both of them staring at the heat map Eliza had built. "Are you going to give it to the same regulator?" Eliza shook her head. "They'll take too long. This needs daylight before someone panics and starts deleting." "You sure?" Eliza nodded. "It's already public. They just haven't noticed." So they did what they'd done before. They prepared the files, wrote the report, verified every number twice. Then they released it, not with a press blast or a social campaign, just a post, 1 link, 1 line of text. Misreported aid, misdirected trust. Within 24 hours, it had been downloaded 70,000 times. Within 48, 3 journalists had followed up. 1 from The Hague, 2 from smaller policy journals that had been circling the fund's inefficiencies for years, but had never found the thread. Eliza had found it in 2 evenings and a stack of budget line items someone else had skimmed. The story didn't go viral. It went deep. Investigators got involved. Meetings were canceled. A review board issued a statement filled with bureaucratic hedging, but it didn't matter. The receipts were clean. And this time, no one scoffed. No one called it a fluke. No one said the girl with the notebook had just gotten lucky. In fact, they didn't call her a girl at all. They called her an auditor, an analyst, an expert. Samantha watched the shift happen like a slow sunrise. People still whispered, still speculated, still argued about how a teenager could have uncovered what no one else had. But they no longer questioned if she had. The disbelief had vanished. What replaced it was respect. And with respect came something even rarer, fear. Because now every institution with a spreadsheet and a slogan knew the same thing. Eliza might be looking. And if she was, the numbers had to make sense. One evening, as snow began falling softly across the windows, Eliza turned from her desk and said, "They're not fixing it. They're hiding it better." Samantha nodded. "That's what systems do when they're afraid of being seen. I want to build something that makes hiding harder than fixing." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "A watchdog?" "No," Eliza said. "A mirror. Something you can't shut off. Something that makes dishonesty feel heavier every time you choose it." She stayed up late working on the concept, a platform that took public data and rewrote it in plain language. Not to simplify, but to make sure people couldn't pretend they didn't understand. She mocked up early drafts. The tool wasn't loud. It wasn't political. It just took complex filings, rewrote the summaries, and added one final prompt at the end. "Do you believe this is honest? Yes or no?" That was it. And still it terrified people. Because when the choice is that clear, you can't hide behind confusion. They called the tool Lens. They didn't pitch it. They didn't fundraise. They released it into the world like they always did. Quietly, carefully, knowing it would reach the people who needed it. And it did. Policy analysts, local reporters, watchdogs, even students. People who had always known something was wrong but didn't have the language. Now they did. And Eliza gave it to them not with fanfare, but with a link and a note. Transparency isn't what we share. It's what we refuse to bury. Samantha read that line a dozen times. It wasn't a slogan. It was a warning. And the next time someone tried to lie with numbers, they would remember the girl with the notebook and think twice. Because she wasn't just watching now. She was building tools so everyone else could, too. Spring came late that year, like it was unsure of its welcome. The trees outside the house stayed bare longer than usual, and even the birds seemed cautious in their return. Inside, however, the rhythm of work never paused. Eliza had 3 notebooks going at once, one for new data leads, one for rewriting the structure of Lens, and one just for questions, pages and pages of them. She called it her Echo Journal. Because the good questions, she said, don't answer themselves right away. They echo for a while. Samantha watched her daughter from across the room, amazed still by the balance she kept. How calmly Eliza carried the weight of clarity, how she managed to remain steady when entire organizations were shaken by the truths she made visible. Lens had gone further than they imagined. Universities requested it for ethics classes. Nonprofits built training programs around it. Whistleblowers used it to structure their evidence before speaking up. Samantha had spent most of the last month reviewing licensing requests, trying to protect the platform from being diluted or co-opted. Eliza didn't worry about that. The people who want to misuse it won't understand it well enough to make it work, she said. And she was right. One afternoon, as sunlight finally warmed the porch and the last of the frost faded from the edges of the window panes, Samantha received a message from a law firm. They were representing a client under investigation, a mid-tier executive who claimed Lens had misrepresented his role in a funding misreport. The language was stiff, but underneath it was fear. Samantha called Eliza into the room. "They're trying to say your tool is biased," she said. Eliza read the message and then nodded slowly. Of course they are, because Lens didn't just show what happened. It showed what he knew and when he knew it. They want to argue with the mirror. Do you want to respond? I want to improve the reflection. She returned to her notebook and began building a timeline visualization tool, a component that tracked a person's decision exposure over time, showing not just the data trail, but the visibility they had into it at each step. She called it Viewport. With it, anyone reading a report could understand whether a decision-maker had the information they needed when they acted, or whether they'd ignored it. It didn't accuse. It illuminated. The first time they tested it, Samantha watched the curve reshape a complex case into something comprehensible. There were no villains, just choices, missed patterns, Suppressed instincts, gaps no one wanted to admit had been there. Viewport didn't scream fraud. It said gently but firmly, here's where the silence started. By the end of the week, Eliza had deployed the update across all active lens installations. She wrote a note to accompany it. Truth is not a spotlight. It's a widening circle. The closer you are to it, the clearer your role becomes. Samantha read the note and felt something shift, not in the world outside, but in herself. There had been a time when she thought all she could do was protect Eliza from what she was becoming, but now she understood. Her job was never protection. It was partnership. It was creating enough space, enough support for Eliza to keep following the threads only she could see. One night, after a quiet dinner and hours of working in separate rooms, Samantha found Eliza on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, looking at the stars. "Do you ever wonder what happens when you're not in the room?" she asked. Samantha sat beside her. "You mean when they're left to fix it without you?" Eliza nodded. "I think some of them do, the ones who saw you speak, who read your work. They might not say it out loud, but they hear your questions in their heads now." Eliza turned. "That's enough?" "It's more than most people ever leave behind." They fell into a long silence, one made of night sounds and wind and the gentle creak of the porch wood beneath them. Then Eliza said, "I don't want to be the reason people get scared." "You're not," Samantha said. "You're the reason they remember to look closer." Another breeze passed through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a bird called out once and fell quiet again, and Eliza, barely above a whisper, said, "Then I'll keep going." Samantha reached over, wrapped her arm around her daughter, and pulled her close. "You always have." The light changed in early summer, growing longer and warmer, casting long ribbons across the walls of their house every evening around 7. Eliza had started working on the floor again, not because her desk was too small, but because she said she needed to think with her whole body. Samantha didn't question it. There were now papers spread from one end of the living room to the other, tiny dots of color-coded annotations clustered like constellations, and overlapping heat maps printed in black and white, because their color printer had long since run out of ink. The house had become a lab, a canvas, a war room. Eliza was building something new, not a correction system this time, not a diagnostic platform or an accountability tracker. This project didn't start with a fraud or a whistleblower or a moment of public reckoning. It started with a blank page and a question she had written on it in the center of a circle. What would it look like if the truth didn't need defending? She had explained it to Samantha one night, after dinner, notebook in hand, and eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. "Everyone reacts to fraud like it's a fire," she said, "but fires are just the end. I want to build a forest system, something that tracks how honesty grows, or doesn't. Something that shows where attention lives, what gets watered, what gets ignored." Samantha had said nothing at first, just watched her daughter talk, watched her draw, watched her build language out of silence. She had always known Eliza's mind moved differently. What she hadn't realized until that moment was that Eliza no longer just wanted to expose what was broken. She wanted to cultivate what might thrive if someone paid attention early enough. The first draft of the system was a behavioral archive tool, not surveillance, Eliza hated that word, but participation mapping. It tracked who showed up to decisions, who followed through, who paused to ask good questions. It assigned no grades, issued no scores. It simply offered reflections. You were consistent this week. You reused 3 assumptions without testing them. You gave someone room to disagree. It mattered. Samantha called it beautiful. Eliza called it seed. They built it together in long, thoughtful stretches. Mornings spent on structure, afternoons testing scenarios, evenings talking about why so many systems waited for collapse before they started caring about people. It was a quiet kind of work. No headlines, no scandals, no grand reveal, but it changed them. Seed went into soft release through a network of educational programs already familiar with Lens. They didn't pitch it as a solution. They offered it as an exploration. "Try this," Eliza wrote in the onboarding note. "See what it teaches you about what you're already doing well." Within weeks, the responses began to arrive. A teacher wrote, "My students thought it was boring," until one said, "This is the first time I've seen a system notice me for something other than falling behind." A manager wrote, "We implemented Seed to help onboard interns. They ended up teaching us where we were assuming too much." One day, Eliza received a letter in the mail, real paper, handwritten ink. It was from a retired nonprofit director who had spent years trying to standardize impact measurement in community projects. He had stumbled on Seed through a former colleague and started using it to understand why some initiatives failed quietly even when funding was secure. "You made me realize we weren't tracking trust. We were just tracking transactions. Thank you for giving us a way to see where we stopped listening." Eliza read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into the back of her notebook. That night, sitting under the soft lamp glow, her voice came out small. "I think I'm finally building something before the lie happens." Samantha looked up from her tea. "You are? I used to think the most powerful moment was catching the deception. And now? Now I think it's stopping the silence that lets it grow." Samantha nodded. There was nothing more to say. The next morning, they walked to the cafe at the end of their block, the sun barely up, the sidewalks empty. Eliza ordered tea and oatmeal, then opened her notebook across the table and pointed to a new drawing, an open-loop diagram labeled Belief, Attention, Accountability, Repair, Belief. She tapped the space between the last arrow and the first word. "This is where I want to work," she said. "The repair back to belief." Samantha smiled. "That's the hardest part." "I know," Eliza said, "but that's where people start trusting each other again." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't feel empty but rooted. Outside, the world continued in its usual rhythm: appointments, headlines, negotiations, performances. But inside that cafe, a different rhythm was building. The kind that doesn't chase catastrophe, the kind that grows slowly, like trust. The kind of rhythm that begins before things fall apart, the kind that catches what matters before it slips away. And in that rhythm, a girl once dismissed for holding a notebook in the wrong room was now redesigning the rooms themselves, quietly, carefully, and without apology. The house was quiet again, not in the way it had been during the scandal, when the silence felt like the air was holding its breath, but in the way things get quiet when a system works. Eliza had fallen into a rhythm that made sense for her. Up before the sun, 2 hours of reading or modeling or mapping whatever new question she'd written in her echo journal the night before. Then breakfast with her notebook open beside her bowl. Then the rest of the day, weaving between ideas and code and long stretches of staring out the window, not to rest, but to think. Samantha had adjusted to the new pace too. She stopped trying to fill the empty space between Eliza's breakthroughs and instead started listening for what followed them: a deep breath, a scribble, a new question. It was in those moments that she saw it, the reason why people in high offices and conference panels and boardrooms feared what Eliza represented. Because she wasn't trying to win, she wasn't trying to disrupt, she was trying to understand. And people who seek to understand are much harder to predict, much harder to defeat, much harder to ignore. Seed continued to spread, not in explosive waves, but in steady branches. Small teams and nonprofits adopted it. Independent developers began integrating it into platforms with names Samantha had never heard of. Sometimes Eliza would find screenshots online of people quietly citing its insight in changelogs or retrospectives, usually with notes like, "We realized we'd stopped asking each other if the work still made sense. There was no marketing, no CEO, no fundraising campaign, just usefulness, just truth." One morning, Samantha found Eliza kneeling beside the coffee table, writing on the underside of one of her network diagrams. She was using two different pens, tracing two lines that looped back on themselves in a way that looked like a mistake until you realized it wasn't. "Is this for seed?" Samantha asked. "No," Eliza said. "It's bigger." She sat back and looked up, blinking, like she'd just returned from somewhere very far away. "I want to map how systems stop noticing people." Samantha pulled up a chair. "You mean organizational systems?" "I mean all of them. Social, economic, academic. When someone's voice stops influencing the environment they're in, that's when harm starts. But it doesn't start as harm. It starts as distance. I think I can track it." "You're building a human feedback loop." Eliza nodded. "Only it's not a loop if one side stops responding." She called the project Bridge. At first it was just a thought experiment, a series of conditional diagrams. But like all her ideas, it quickly grew a framework, and then an interface, and soon she was sitting on the floor again, laptop glowing, patch cords running across the carpet, a second monitor resting on a stack of books because her desk was already full of earlier builds. Bridge wasn't designed for companies. It wasn't for leadership. It was for the overlooked, the intern, the volunteer, the kid who noticed something was broken but didn't have the words or the authority to say it. It allowed them to log patterns in their environment, not whistleblowing, not accusations, just observation. A place to say, "I've noticed this shift," or "We used to do this and now we don't," or "I'm not sure if this matters, but it feels important." Bridge didn't collect personal data. It didn't expose anything. It simply looked for convergence. If enough people inside a system noticed the same shift, it flagged it, internally, quietly, with one prompt. Would this look different if everyone felt heard? They tested it at a youth organization first. 30 days in, the executive director called Samantha in tears. "We realized we'd created a structure where nobody wanted to be the first to say they were tired," she said. "Bridge didn't tell us what to fix. It showed us that our people already knew what needed fixing." When Eliza heard that, she didn't smile. She simply said, "Good. That's what it's for." By summer, Bridge had been quietly adopted by 8 more programs. It didn't make noise. It made room. And Samantha realized something that evening as she watched her daughter write late into the night, under the porch light, hoodie sleeves rolled up to her elbows, legs crossed, pencil moving in smooth, deliberate arcs. Eliza was no longer fighting against systems. She was designing better ones, ones that began by believing the quiet people, the overlooked, the ones who sat in the back of the room with their observations and questions and doubts that nobody ever asked about. The ones like her. And maybe that was the biggest shift of all, not that they stopped laughing, but that they stopped assuming silence meant nothing was being seen, because Eliza had taught them better. The air was warm enough now to leave the windows cracked open at night. Samantha liked the way it made the whole house feel like it was breathing, quiet in, quiet out. Outside, cicadas hummed in long, even waves, and the occasional car passed slowly down the street, headlights gliding like soft questions across the walls. Inside, Eliza worked the same way she always had, low light, paper spread out on the floor, her laptop humming next to a pile of uncapped pens and half-drunk tea. But something had shifted in her posture. Not tension. Focus. Not restlessness. Anticipation. Bridge had started to ripple. It wasn't a product. It wasn't something you launched. It was a presence, a way of listening, a quiet logic that settled into organizations, teams, classrooms, and asked a single question again and again. Who isn't being heard here? And now people were responding. Slowly at first, then with something closer to relief. A letter came in from a nonprofit that served domestic workers. One of their staff members had started using Bridge anonymously, not to complain, but to log subtle changes. A training session that had been canceled, a decision that bypassed usual input, a shift in tone. She had no way of knowing others were logging similar entries. But the system caught it. It sent a prompt to leadership. There is a noticeable reduction in perceived transparency over the past 3 weeks. Would you like to review anonymized indicators? They did. And what they found wasn't malice. It was absence. A series of autopiloted decisions that had left key staff feeling adrift. They wrote to Eliza and Samantha not with fanfare, but with honesty. Your system didn't warn us. It reminded us. And that might have saved everything. Samantha showed the letter to Eliza one morning while she was eating toast with peanut butter and staring at a map of organizational feedback loops. Eliza read it twice, then nodded. Good. That means the echo is working. She spent the rest of that week rebuilding the core of the model. Not because it was broken, but because she believed it could be gentler. Bridge had been built with clarity in mind. Now she wanted to add nuance, a way for the system to recognize intention, not just pattern. A way to understand when people were trying, even if they were missing the mark. Samantha asked, "Won't that make the data less pure?" Eliza didn't hesitate. "It'll make it more human." She wrote a new layer of logic, one that weighted decisions not just by impact, but by response. Did someone try to fix it? Did they ask a question after realizing they might have misunderstood? Did they change a pattern voluntarily? The new system didn't just show drift. It showed course correction. It didn't just map silence. It mapped sincerity. A school picked it up next, a public high school outside of Denver. One of the teachers had followed Eliza's work since the Gala. She installed the open-source version of Bridge into a student leadership program. Within a month, they uncovered something no adult had seen. The students weren't disengaged. They were deferring. Each one thought the others had stronger opinions, so none of them spoke. Bridge collected the hesitation. It surfaced it gently, and when they read the collective entries aloud in a meeting, one of the students said, "It's like the system saw the conversation we didn't know how to start." Eliza smiled when she read that. That was the point. Not automation, not control, recognition. She added a new prompt to the system. This entry will not fix the problem. It will help us see it sooner. Proceed? Bridge was now in 42 institutions. None of them advertised it. They didn't want press. They wanted peace. And somehow Eliza had made software that wasn't disruptive. It was restorative. It gave people a way to speak before things broke. A way to say, "I'm not okay with this," or "I'm not sure we're aligned," without fear of becoming the problem for naming a problem. Samantha watched it happen again and again. People didn't leave because things were hard. They left because they didn't believe anyone would listen. And now, someone, something, was listening. One evening, Eliza came out onto the porch, barefoot, notebook in hand. Samantha was already there, legs curled beneath her, tea in hand. Eliza sat beside her and said, "I think it's working." "I know it is," Samantha replied. "No, I mean bigger than the tool. I mean the idea that noticing is enough to change the outcome." Samantha looked at her. "You've always believed that." "I used to think I had to catch the lie. Now I think I just have to ask the right questions soon enough." They sat in silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. Then Eliza said, "You think they'll forget?" "Who?" "All of them. The ones who said I shouldn't have been on that stage. The ones who scoffed." Samantha smiled. "They don't forget. They rewrite." Eliza nodded. "Then we just have to keep writing the truth louder." And they would. Not with headlines, not with viral clips, with systems, or with tools, with invitations to speak, even if no one in the room is ready to hear it yet. Because once they scoffed when a girl walked into a gala with a notebook. Now they were using her words to find their way back to themselves. The days stretched longer now. The kind of light that lingered late into the evening, touching everything with gold before it slipped away. Samantha had started noticing how Eliza moved differently, not rushed, not frantic, but with a steadiness that had matured into something more deliberate. Every project, every note in her journal, every email she sent or ignored was done with purpose. There was a quiet in her that hadn't been there before, not the silence of caution, but the calm of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and no longer felt she needed to explain it. Bridge had reached its 100th implementation, not through marketing, not through hype, through usefulness. Some called it the mirror, others the pause button. A few teams, jokingly and with affection, nicknamed it the conscience. It didn't correct behavior. It simply revealed behavior as it was happening. It gave teams and individuals the ability to see when their choices were starting to drift from their values, before those choices hardened into policy or into culture or into damage. A civic leadership coalition used it to map their internal decision grid. When the system flagged a slow erosion of cross-departmental feedback, no one was shocked, but no one had seen it documented either. One executive said, "I thought we were just moving fast. I didn't realize we'd stopped looking at each other." The organization realigned their meeting structure within 2 weeks. No fallout, no apology tours, just acknowledgement. That was the power of it. Bridge didn't shame. It asked, "Are you still in sync?" Samantha had seen a lot of tools in her time, platforms that promised transparency, metrics that claimed to show truth. But nothing worked like this. Nothing created conditions for self-correction without fear. And she knew why. Because Eliza didn't build it to be used. She built it to be understood. And that difference lived in every line of code. They sat together one evening, their porch lights dim behind them, stars visible through the thin branches overhead. Eliza had her notebook in her lap, her pencil tucked behind one ear. She was wearing a T-shirt from a hackathon she'd attended 2 years ago, one she'd left early because the judges didn't take her seriously until after she solved their challenge in half the expected time. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about what happens when a system sees more than the people inside it want to." Samantha looked over. "What do you mean?" "There's this edge," Eliza continued, "between visibility and defensiveness. You show someone too much, too fast, and they'll shut it down. They'll blame the mirror, but if you show them just enough early enough, they can still choose to fix it." Samantha nodded. "You want to redesign that threshold?" Eliza tapped her pencil once against the notebook. "I want to teach the system to recognize fear." Samantha blinked. "Emotional fear?" "No, structural. The fear that comes from realizing your decisions aren't as clean as you thought. The fear that makes people double down instead of course correcting." Samantha leaned back, watching the wind move through the leaves. "You know that's what they felt that night, right? The ones in the Gala?" Eliza nodded once. "They felt their story slipping." "And you gave them a new one," Samantha said, "a more honest one. They didn't like it. They didn't have to. It was true." Eliza returned to her notes. For a long while, neither of them spoke. When the next report came through, a quiet data set from a research collective using Bridge to assess how academic teams shared credit, it revealed something unexpected. The more junior members of a team were more likely to defer recognition if they believed pushing for credit would destabilize group harmony. The result wasn't just unequal acknowledgement. It was long-term burnout, silent disengagement, and eventually departure. Eliza added a new feature, a confidence indicator that tracked the emotional cost of speaking up, drawn from response hesitations and revision patterns. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Teams started catching the drift early. Leaders began asking better questions. People stayed. One user wrote in and said, "This system doesn't protect whistleblowers. It makes sure no one needs to become one." Eliza copied that line and pinned it to her wall. In the months that followed, requests came in from places they hadn't expected. Municipal governments, creative collectives, small foundations looking to repair trust from within. Eliza didn't rush to scale. She never had. She watched. She adjusted. She said no when she had to. Bridge wasn't for spectacle. It was for stewardship. And in all that time, not once did she mention the gala. Not once did she bring up the moment that started it all. But Samantha knew it was always there, quietly woven into the code, into the ethics, into the design of every prompt that asked, what would change if we noticed each other sooner? One night after a long day of writing, Eliza looked up from her desk and asked, "Do you think they still remember what happened?" Samantha smiled. It doesn't matter if they remember the moment. They're still living inside the consequences. Eliza thought about that for a long time. Then she said, "I'm okay with that," and went back to writing. The warmth lingered deep into fall that year, long past when it was supposed to. The trees clung to their leaves like they weren't ready to let go yet, as if they sensed something wasn't finished. In the house, that same feeling took root, something not quite ending, something still becoming. Samantha watched it unfold in the quiet ways Eliza worked. She no longer rushed to finish one system so she could start the next. She let them braid together. Pulse had become bridge. Bridge had grown into lens. Seed still lived in quiet places. And now, Eliza was letting them all talk to each other. She never said it outright, but Samantha could see it. Her daughter was building an ecosystem. It started with the framework she scrawled across 4 pages of her Echo journal one morning before breakfast. She taped it to the hallway wall, where sunlight caught the corners and curled the paper slowly inward. Each page had a different word at the center: truth, attention, repair, trust. Around each word were loops, notes, ideas, cause and effect lines, feedback paths. But the lines didn't lead outward. They connected across the pages, from word to word, until everything felt like part of the same nervous system. Eliza stepped back and stared at it for a long time, arms crossed, pencil tucked behind her ear. When Samantha walked by, she stopped. "Eliza," she said quietly, "is this a map?" Eliza nodded. "Of how systems heal." It wasn't a new tool, not yet. It was an interface philosophy, a way to think about the relationship between data and behavior, between noticing and deciding. She was reworking the foundation of her own work, not because it was broken, but because she'd learned something no one had taught her. When a system helps people see themselves clearly, it should also help them forgive what they missed. Otherwise, all you create is guilt. Guilt doesn't build anything. Most platforms, she told Samantha later, only show you what went wrong. I want to build one that shows you how to get it right again. She started working on something she called Echo Bridge, not a product, a thread between all the others. It took the insights from Pulse, the early signals of misalignment, and paired them with Bridge's map of relationship drift. Then it overlaid Lens, translating the institutional language into honest reflection. Finally, it wove in Seed, the parts that measured quiet care, that remembered when someone chose the hard, honest thing, even when no one was looking. The result was unlike anything she'd built before. It didn't feel like software. It felt like a conversation that remembered you. She designed the first demo for a group of ethics officers at a policy think tank. It walked them through a year of internal communications, not with metrics, but with narration. The platform didn't show charts. It told the story of their choices, how a missed question led to a defensive memo, how a delayed apology hardened into policy, but also how someone changed course quietly, how a low-confidence comment eventually became the basis for a better system. When it ended, the room was quiet. One of the directors stood up and said, "I didn't realize the data could show us who we tried to be." Eliza didn't smile. She simply said, "That's the part that matters most." They didn't publish Echo Bridge. They didn't announce it. They offered it to the places that had already shown they wanted to learn before they were forced to. And those places changed, slowly, gently, but deeply. No press, no headlines, just people seeing each other again. Samantha knew then that what happened at the gala was no longer the beginning of the story. It was just a hinge, a necessary rupture that made room for something more enduring. Eliza no longer needed to remind people what she'd done. Her work had outgrown the memory of the moment. It now lived in the systems people trusted when they needed to see themselves honestly. One night, as the last light faded through the windows, Samantha sat beside Eliza at the kitchen table. They had the window open, and a breeze moved through the room, lifting the edges of blueprints and diagrams. "You ever think," Samantha said, "that they still expect you to stop?" Eliza didn't look up from her notebook. "I think some of them hope I will. And I won't," she said simply, "because they still don't know how close they are to fixing it. They just need help seeing it." Samantha rested her chin in her hand. "You ever get tired of being the one who shows them?" Eliza finally looked up. Her face was calm, older maybe, steady in the way someone becomes when they have lived long enough with the weight of truth. "Sometimes," she said. "But then I remember I'm not trying to change them. I'm just trying to leave behind something that listens when they're ready." And in that moment, with the wind in the curtains and the whole house holding still for her words, Samantha understood that her daughter was no longer just a girl who saw fraud. She was a systems architect for empathy, and the world, whether it knew it or not, was finally being built in her image. The mornings were cooler now, soft with the promise of real change, and the house felt quieter than usual, not in silence, but in attention. Samantha brewed her coffee without needing to look at the machine, her muscle memory trained by 1,000 mornings of motion. Across the table, Eliza sat curled in the big armchair, legs tucked up under her, her tablet propped on her knees. The house was mostly still, except for the sounds of birds outside and the soft hum of a background process running on Eliza's laptop, one of several experiments she was managing quietly, all tied to Echo Bridge's deeper architecture. She didn't speak. She rarely did when she was thinking. But Samantha knew something was happening. Not a launch, not a decision, a formation. Eliza had begun rebuilding how the ecosystem of her tools talked to each other, not just structurally, but relationally. She wanted Seed to inform Pulse's logic paths. She wanted Lens to capture the emotional tone of entries before Bridge surfaced them. She wanted Echo Bridge to carry a memory of not just what went wrong, but what someone tried to do about it. She called it soft retention, not analytics, not tracking, a kind of institutional kindness. "Systems remember failure," she told Samantha one evening, "but they forget effort. That makes them brittle. I want to build a system that remembers intention without excusing harm." That phrase stuck with Samantha. It wasn't a thing she'd heard before. It wasn't the way most people thought. The world rewarded outcomes, punished impact, and forgot everything in between. But Eliza was trying to stretch that middle space, to make it large enough to hold discomfort and healing at the same time. She had been invited to speak again, this time at a summit on ethical design and digital trust. Samantha hadn't pushed her, hadn't even asked. But the invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago, carefully worded, respectful. They weren't trying to put her on a stage to retell the gala. They wanted to hear how she thought now, what she was seeing next. Eliza didn't reply, not until this morning. She looked up from her tablet, blinking once, as if surfacing from something deep. "I think I want to go." Samantha nodded slowly. "You don't have to." "I know, but I think this time they're ready to hear something other than the story." "You think they're ready for the structure?" "For the reflection," Eliza said. "I don't think most people realize how much of their behavior is shaped by the tools they use to make decisions. If we build better tools, Maybe we stop mistaking avoidance for leadership." Samantha smiled. "And you're going to say that out loud in a room full of executives?" Eliza shrugged. "They already brought me the mic." The prep was light. Eliza didn't build slides. She built a simulation. It used anonymized data from early bridge users, teams that had volunteered to share what happened when they logged emotional drift, when they paused to reflect, when they named a feeling before it calcified into policy. The model played out two paths for each entry: what happened when someone listened, and what happened when they didn't. It wasn't dramatic, just human, and the results were staggering. Fewer resignations, fewer conflicts, more consistent output, and above all, more honesty. The day of the summit, the room was full but hushed. Not nervous, expectant. They'd all heard the story. The girl who stood up at the gala, the notebook, the billion-dollar fraud. What they hadn't heard was what came after. The years of building, refining, reshaping how systems interpret truth. Eliza didn't stand behind the podium. She walked in front of it. "I'm not here to talk about corruption," she began. "I'm here to talk about how it starts and how it ends quietly if someone pays attention early enough." She walked them through the interface, showed them what it looked like when a system noticed discomfort, when it gave someone the language to say, "I think we're drifting. I think we forgot what we meant to do. I think we stopped listening somewhere back there." Then she showed them what it looked like when that language wasn't used. The simulation didn't accuse. It mourned. Eliza closed her presentation with a prompt, one the system used when it sensed a critical reflection point. "What would need to be true for you to feel safe telling the truth here?" She left that on the screen as she stepped down. No applause at first, just silence. Then a standing ovation. Not for the story, for the mirror. Afterward, in the hallway, a woman approached her quietly, older, thoughtful. "I've been designing enterprise systems for 20 years, she said, "and I've never once asked if the tools I build make people braver or smaller." Eliza looked her in the eye and said, "You're asking now. That's where it starts." Back home, the house was the same. Light spilling through the windows, tea on the counter, a fresh notebook waiting on the table. But something had shifted. Eliza had moved from the girl who caught the lie to the woman building a world where we don't have to. The rain started late that night, just as the wind had settled, tapping lightly against the windows like a reminder. Samantha stood at the kitchen sink, the house dark behind her except for the hallway light, watching the branches sway in rhythmic silence. Eliza had gone to sleep early, or at least retreated to her room, but Samantha could still see the soft glow of her desk lamp seeping out from under the door. Even in rest, her daughter never stopped thinking. She carried questions the way other people carried breath. Quiet, constant, necessary. The summit had left an echo, not in headlines or trending posts, but in inboxes, in voicemails, in handwritten notes that began arriving in the days after. Letters from policy architects, school administrators, product designers, startup founders. Some offered collaborations, some confessed, others just said thank you. They wrote about moments they'd remembered only after Eliza's talk, moments when they had stayed silent, chosen convenience, or simply hadn't realized the cost of not listening. The simulation had done something more profound than provoke. It had reminded people they'd known better and hadn't acted. Eliza read each one without judgment. She didn't save them all. She responded to a few. She never replied with advice, only with questions, the same kind she wrote in the back of her journal. What changed after you stayed quiet? Who noticed anyway? What would have been different if you asked one more question before saying yes? Samantha asked her once, "Don't you ever want to say, 'I told you so'?" Eliza didn't look up from her notebook. "That's not the point." The system was growing, not in scale, but in depth. Echo Bridge had become more than a tool. It was becoming a discipline, Some called it behavioral architecture. Others said it was structural mindfulness. Eliza called it designing for emotional recursion, the idea that honesty is rarely singular, that it loops, that it returns, that if you model your environment to receive it well, people will try again. She spent most of that month building a new layer for the platform, one that tracked what happened after someone made the right choice. Not just whether the outcome improved, but whether the person was supported, whether the team adapted, whether the system grew stronger from the truth or merely survived it. She named the module Tether, because it wasn't enough to surface truth, it had to connect. One school using Echo Bridge sent back a story. A student had used the platform to quietly express confusion about how credit was assigned in group projects. She hadn't wanted to confront the teacher directly, but her comment triggered a pattern match in Tether, showing 3 other students had logged similar concerns. The teacher, who'd never seen herself as unfair, revised the structure and then asked the students to help redesign it. "You made it safe for them to shape their own environment," she wrote. "I thought I was creating inclusion. I didn't realize I was just waiting for someone to tap me on the shoulder." Eliza read the message and nodded. That's the beginning of repair. By the start of fall, Eliza had started writing a guide, not a manual, not documentation, a guide for people who wanted to build systems that noticed others sooner. She didn't want to call it a book, she called it a companion. It wasn't about the tools, it was about the questions you asked while using them. She organized it by scenarios. When someone is too quiet, when disagreement hides in politeness, when urgency becomes an excuse, when people call avoidance a strategy. Each section ended with one line. What could this look like if we chose to see more? Samantha read a draft one morning with coffee in hand, her chest tight by the end of page 10. It wasn't heavy. It was precise. The kind of precision that made you feel like you'd been seen in all the ways you didn't admit to. She closed the pages and walked into the room where Eliza was watching the morning light move slowly across the floor. "You know they'll call this a movement, right?" Samantha said. Eliza didn't look over. "They can call it what they want. I'm just trying to give people the tools to pay attention before regret is their only option." Samantha sat beside her. "And you think that's enough?" Eliza finally turned. "It has to be. Because every time someone looks closer, they teach the system to do the same." Later that evening, Samantha stood by the window again. Rain had returned, soft against the glass. The house was quiet, but not still. She could feel it. The hum of something building, not a storm, not another scandal. Something better. A culture forming, a language expanding. A world reshaping itself around the quiet idea that noticing people early, before they break, before they give up, before they become footnotes, isn't idealistic. It's systemic design. And it all started because one girl refused to let a lie become a legacy. Now, they weren't scoffing anymore. They were watching, learning, following. And Eliza? She was still building.